A rust-colored dust settled over a young woman in a black mourning dress as she signed her name to a single thin sheet of paper. Across the lawyer's desk, her two brothers exchanged a smirk, already dividing the ranch, the cattle, and every dollar the family had ever earned. All she had been handed was the deed to a waterless canyon so worthless, the whole territory laughed at its name. 3 days south, she reined her horse to a stop at the mouth of that canyon and stared into a barren gash of red stone where nothing grew and no water ran. Her legs buckled, and she pressed her face into the animal's dusty coat as the truth of her inheritance settled over her. Then, high on the western wall 200 feet above, a sharp flash of light broke from the bare rock and vanished. She lowered her hands and fixed her eyes on the spot, waiting. The next afternoon, at the same hour, the flash returned in exactly the same place, and she understood that something up there had been placed by human hands. What would you do if the only thing your father left you was an insult? If after a lifetime of quiet devotion, your brothers inherited the ranch, the cattle, the cash, every last dollar your family had ever earned from the Arizona dirt, while all you received was a deed to a stretch of rock so worthless the entire territory had turned it into a joke? This was the inheritance of Maren Callister, a barren canyon, a public humiliation, the cold silence of a family that had already written her off. But the truth buried in that sun-baked stone was a secret language of love, a final gift more valuable than any herd or banknote, hidden for 15 years by the one man who truly saw her. Settle in and stay close as we journey into the heart of a forgotten canyon and uncover the story of a daughter's vindication. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. The office of Mr. Pritchard smelled of lamp oil, old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where bad news had been delivered so many times the walls had absorbed it. The lawyer sat behind a desk of polished mesquite, his spectacles low on the bridge of his nose, his fingers resting on a document folded into precise legal thirds. The morning light through the single window fell across the room in a flat white blade, cutting the space between the living and the dead. Maren Callister sat in the hard-backed chair closest to the door. Her morning dress, black wool too heavy for the Arizona heat, was already dusted with the fine rust-colored grit that coated everything in Buckhorn. Her hands were folded in her lap, still and pale against the dark fabric, though beneath the calm exterior, her pulse hammered with a dread she could not name. She was 22 years old. Her father had been in the ground for 6 days. Across from her, filling the remaining chairs with the easy confidence of men who already knew the outcome, sat her brothers. Dalton, the eldest at 30, occupied the center of the room as though it belonged to him. His boots were new, the leather oiled to a high sheen, his gun belt polished, his hat set on the desk beside the lawyer's inkwell, with the casual entitlement of a man planting a flag. Silas, 27, sat slightly behind his brother, his posture an echo, his eyes fixed on the window, on the dusty main street of Buckhorn, on anything that was not his sister's face. Mr. Pritchard cleared his throat. The sound cracked through the silence like a dry twig. The last will and testament of Ephraim Callister, filed with this office on the 14th of March, 1885. He adjusted his spectacles, though they did not need adjusting. To my eldest son, Dalton Callister, I leave the ranch, all livestock, the contents of the bank account held at Buckhorn Savings, and full authority over the management of the Callister estate. Dalton did not move. He did not need to. The words merely confirmed what his posture had already declared. To my second son, Silas Callister, I leave the southern pastureland, 40 head of cattle from the spring herd, and the right to draw water from the ranch's eastern well. Silas shifted in his chair, a small, tight nod, almost involuntary, as though receiving an order he had not asked for. To my daughter, Maren Callister. The pause lasted only a second, but in that second the room changed. The light seemed to harden. The dust motes froze in their slow, tumbling descent. I leave the parcel of land known locally as Callister's Folly. The deed and legal description are attached herein. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, packed tight with meaning, with judgment, with the weight of a decision made from beyond the grave. Dalton's lips twitched. The smirk he had been holding back surfaced, brief and sharp, the kind of expression a man wears when a suspicion is confirmed. Father had a sense of humor right to the end. Maren did not look at him. She looked at the lawyer, at the folded document being slid across the polished surface toward her, at the black ink of the legal script visible through the thin paper. Callister's Folly. A canyon 60 miles south of Buckhorn. A waterless, useless gash in the earth. Her father had purchased 20 years ago in what everyone in the territory called a fit of fancy. He had never visited it. Not once, according to every story she had ever heard. It was the kind of property men mentioned at card tables when they needed an example of a bad bet. Her father's name was the punchline. Now it was hers. Mr. Pritchard produced a pen, dipped it in the inkwell, offered it with an expression caught between professional neutrality and something softer, something that might have been pity if he had allowed it to fully form. Your signature here, Miss Callister. Her hand trembled as she took the pen. She was aware of Dalton's gun belt creaking as he shifted with smug impatience, of Silas staring out the window, with the fixed determination of a man who has chosen not to witness what is happening. She dipped the nib. She signed. The loops of the letters felt foreign, as though someone else were guiding her fingers. Maren Callister, owner of a worthless canyon. The ink was as black as her dress, as final as the dirt on her father's coffin. Mr. Pritchard blotted the signature with a square of felt, folded the document, with precise practice snaps placed it in an envelope. It is all in order. He handed it to her. The paper was thin, fragile. It contained the entirety of her worldly possessions. She stood, her chair scraping softly on the wooden floor. Her brothers remained seated. They watched her with expressions she would remember for the rest of her life. A mixture of pity so shallow it was almost performance. Relief so naked it was almost cruel. She was no longer their problem. She was now the desert's problem. I will need my horse. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, a flat, clear note in the heavy air. Dalton waved a hand. Silas will fetch him from the livery. Your things are in the saddlebags. A pause. Not much, but. He let the sentence trail unfinished, as if her poverty were a door he did not want to open all the way. Not much. A change of clothes. A small tin of her mother's sewing needles. A worn book of poems. The artifacts of a life that no longer existed. She walked out of the office, through the narrow hallway, through the front door, into the blinding glare of an Arizona morning. The heat struck her like a wall. Buckhorn carried on around her, indifferent to her presence, indifferent to her loss. Men led mule teams toward the freight depot. A woman with a market basket crossed the street, dodging a slow-moving wagon. Two boys chased each other around the corner of the feed store, their laughter bright and careless. A sound from a world Maren no longer inhabited. No one noticed the quiet woman in black standing on the boardwalk, holding an envelope that was both a deed and a dismissal. A memory arrived without warning, sharp enough to cut. She was 12, kneeling beside her father in the barn, watching his calloused hands wrap a linen bandage around the foreleg of a lame mare. His fingers, scarred from the forge, moved with a gentleness that always surprised her. He did not speak. He never needed to, not when his hands were doing the talking. She had passed him the salve without being asked, had held the mare's halter steady, had matched his silence with her own. When he finished, he had looked at her. A brief, rare glance, the closest thing to praise he ever offered. She had carried that glance for 10 years. A coin she could not spend but refused to surrender. The deed in her hand felt like his final word on the matter, a verdict declaring that all those years of quiet service, of showing up, of being steady and present and useful were worth exactly nothing. She tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of her dress and stepped off the boardwalk into the dust. The mercantile was 3 doors down. Mr. Gooding, the storekeeper, was a fleshy man with an apron stretched tight across his belly, known throughout Buckhorn for his ability to extract gossip while weighing flour. He counted Maren's coins with an air of concern so theatrical it bordered on performance. Heading south, are you, Miss Callister? His eyes scanned her face for cracks. Long ride. Be careful of the sun. It was a kindness that felt like a stone dropped into her pocket. heavy and hard and impossible to put down. She thanked him, gathered her supplies, a sack of flour, a slab of bacon wrapped in waxed paper, a small pouch of coffee, a canteen she could barely afford, and walked out. Dalton was waiting for her. He leaned against the awning post outside the mercantile, his arms crossed, his hat tipped back, his posture arranged for an audience. The men idling on the bench beside the horse trough were that audience, three ranch hands with nothing to do on a Tuesday morning, but listen. Stocking up for your new life as a rock farmer, sister? His voice carried the full length of the boardwalk. The ranch hands chuckled. One of them spat tobacco juice into the dust, a punctuation mark. Maren cinched the supply sack to the back of her saddle. She did not look at him. Don't do this here, Dalton. Low, quiet. A request, not a plea. His laughter was a harsh public thing. Do what? I am only wishing you well. Everyone in the territory knows about Callister's folly. Father used to laugh about it himself. Said he bought it so no other fool would waste his money. He pushed himself off the post, took a step closer. His shadow fell over her. Go back east, Maren. Find a husband. There is nothing for you here. The words landed in the open air of the street, visible to every eye, audible to every ear within 50 feet. A public disowning. A final severing, performed not in the privacy of the family home, but on the main street of Buckhorn, where it would become story, become legend, become the thing people whispered about at the general store for weeks. Maren turned. She met his gaze, gray eyes holding brown, her silence a wall he could not breach. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind his bravado. His jaw tightened, his eyes dropped. Then the mask returned, arrogance snapping back into place like a lid slamming shut. He turned on his heel and walked away without another word, his boots loud on the wooden planks. Silas had not come. She noticed his absence the way you notice a missing tooth by the gap it leaves. She finished her knots. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of years spent tying, mending, securing. The knuckles were white. The fingers did not shake. She checked the girth strap on Flint's saddle, adjusted the saddlebags, tightened the supply sack. Flint, a blue roan gelding with a dark stripe down his spine, stood patient and still, his ears swiveling toward sounds she could not hear. He had been her father's horse before he was hers, the last living thing that connected her to Ephraim Callister. She was reaching for the saddle horn when a voice reached her, thin as wire, steady as stone. Child. Mrs. Adler sat in the sliver of shade beside the post office, a woman so old the town had stopped guessing her age. She was a widow, the former school teacher of a school that no longer existed, her face a terrain of deep lines, her white hair pulled back in a tight knot. She had lived in Buckhorn longer than most of the buildings. Maren had seen her 1,000 times, seated in that same spot, watching the town with eyes that missed nothing. They had never exchanged more than a nod. The old woman beckoned with a single crooked finger. Maren hesitated, then led Flint closer. Mrs. Adler studied the horse first, then the rider, her gaze traveling slowly, appraisingly, from the dusty hem of the morning dress to the tight line of the jaw. They gave you the stone place. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the calm certainty of someone reading a thermometer. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Adler's lips pressed together, then released. A faint expression crossed her face. Not pity, not sympathy, but something closer to recognition, as though she were watching a familiar pattern repeat itself. Your father was not a man who wasted. He never drove a nail without a reason. The words hung in the hot, still air. Maren waited for more, but the old woman closed her eyes, settling back against the wall, the conversation over. Her breathing slowed. She might have been asleep. She might have been listening to something only she could hear. Maren sat in the saddle a long moment, the cryptic sentence turning in her mind. He never drove a nail without a reason. It made no practical sense. It was the kind of thing old people said, half proverb, half riddle, its meaning buried under decades of private context. But as she nudged Flint into a walk, leaving the last buildings of Buckhorn behind, the phrase attached itself to her thoughts like a burr to wool, small, sharp, impossible to brush away. The road south left the sparse grasslands within the first mile. descending into broken country where the earth cracked and heaved and split into jagged mesas. Dry arroyos carved by flash floods that came once a year, if they came at all. Stretches of gravel and caliche that reflected the sun with a white blinding fury. Saguaros stood at intervals, their arms raised in postures that looked, depending on the hour and the light, like surrender or benediction. The sky was enormous, a dome of pale blue so vast it made the land beneath it feel like a floor. She rode in silence. There was no other choice. The desert did not invite conversation. It invited endurance. The sun climbed to its zenith, pressing down on her shoulders, baking the black wool of her dress, until the fabric felt like a brand against her skin. Sweat traced lines down her temples, collected in the hollow of her throat, soaked the cloth between her shoulder blades. She drank sparingly from her canteen, measuring each sip against the miles remaining. Flint moved with the unhurried certainty of an animal who understood that distance was not conquered but absorbed, step by patient step. His hooves crunched on gravel, thudded on packed earth, scraped on bare rock. The rhythm was constant, meditative, a heartbeat beneath the silence. She made camp that first night in the shelter of a low mesa, its western face still warm from the day's heat. The fire she built was small, not for warmth in the residual heat of the desert evening, but for company. Its light was a frail, flickering anchor in the immensity of the dark. Above her, the stars emerged in numbers she had never seen from the ranch. Not dozens, but thousands. Then tens of thousands, a cold, brilliant fire, scattered across black velvet so deep it seemed to breathe. Flint stood nearby, his reins looped loosely around a mesquite branch, his head low, one hind foot cocked in rest. His breathing was slow and steady, the only sound in the world besides the faint crackle of the fire. She pressed her palm against his warm shoulder, feeling the muscle shift beneath the hide. He turned his head, his dark eye regarding her with calm attention. "Just you now," she whispered. The fire burned down. The stars turned overhead. She lay in her bedroll, staring upward, feeling the full crushing weight of her solitude. Somewhere to the north, 60 miles away, her brothers were sleeping in the house where she had grown up. The bed she had slept in for 22 years was empty, its sheets already stripped, the room perhaps being converted to storage. She had been erased from the only life she knew, not by force but by legal document, the stroke of a pen, the folding of a paper. The second day was worse. The landscape grew more severe, the mesas taller, the arroyos deeper, the vegetation sparser. The few cottonwoods she passed were dead, their bare branches reaching upward like the hands of drowning men. The heat became a living thing, a pressure against her chest, a weight on her eyelids. She wrapped a bandana over her nose and mouth to filter the dust that rose in fine, choking clouds with every step Flint took. She ate in the saddle, chewing strips of bacon, drinking water she could taste turning warm in the canteen. Her lips cracked. The skin on the backs of her hands began to peel. The morning dress, designed for the cool interior of a church, was a torture device in the open desert, black fabric absorbing every degree of heat the sun could deliver. That second night, she camped in a dry arroyo, its banks providing a low wall against the wind that came up after dark, moaning through the rocks with a voice that sounded almost human. She was too tired to build a fire. She ate cold bacon, drank warm water, curled in her bedroll with her back against the arroyo wall. Flint stood above her on the bank, his silhouette cut against the stars, standing guard with the ancient patience of his kind. She dreamed of her father's forge, the clang of hammer on anvil, rhythmic, purposeful, a music of iron, the smell of coal smoke, of quenched steel, of leather and sweat. She was 10, standing in the doorway, watching him shape a piece of glowing metal. The orange light painted his face in planes of brightness, his features hard and concentrated, closed to everything except the work beneath his hands. He looked up, saw her watching. For a moment his expression did not change. Then, slowly, a small smile. Not wide, not warm, but present. Acknowledgement. She had been seen. She woke to cold dawn light, the dream dissolving, leaving behind an ache so deep it felt geological. Something buried in the bedrock of her. On the morning of the third day, she saw it. The land ahead rose in a long, unbroken wall of red rock, a geological fault running east to west for miles, its face sheer and weathered, its top a ragged edge against the white sky. In this wall, directly ahead, was a cleft, a narrow, deep opening, as though the earth had been split by a single violent blow. According to the rough map Mr. Pritchard had drawn on the back of an envelope, this was the mouth of Callister's Folly. She reined Flint to a stop at the entrance, her heart climbing into her throat. The canyon was worse than anything she had imagined in her darkest moments. The walls rose sheer on both sides, 200 feet of crumbling sandstone the color of dried blood. The floor was a chaotic jumble of fallen boulders, sharp scree, thorny mesquite so dense it formed a barricade. There was no grass, no green of any kind, only the gray-brown palette of stone and dust and thorn. The only movement came from lizards, small gray shapes skittering over the hot rocks with mechanical precision, pausing, jerking forward, vanishing into crevices. There was no water. Every story she had heard was true. Her father had left her a piece of the earth's cruelty, a wound in the ground, a gash no one wanted, no one visited, no one valued. Dalton had been right. The territory had been right. She had traveled 3 days through heat that could kill a man to stand at the edge of nothing. The despair came not as a wave but as a collapse, the sudden removal of a wall she had been leaning against without knowing it. Her legs gave. She slid from the saddle, her boots hitting the ground with a graceless thud, her knees buckling. She caught herself against Flint's shoulder, her forehead pressing into his dusty coat, her fingers gripping the leather of the stirrup strap. She could smell him, horse sweat, trail dust, the faint sweetness of the grain she had fed him that morning. A living smell, a real smell. The only warmth in this dead, indifferent place. The tears came, hot, silent, carving clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She cried for her father, for the belief she had held for 22 years that he saw her, that her quiet devotion had been noted, valued, returned in some private unspoken way. She cried for the home she had lost. The familiar creak of the porch, the smell of bread rising in the kitchen, the sound of rain on the tin roof. She cried for the utter loneliness of standing at the mouth of a dead canyon in a dead landscape with no one on earth who cared whether she lived through the night. When the tears stopped, they left behind an emptiness. Not peace, not acceptance, but the flat, blank stillness of something spent. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the dust smearing into pale streaks across her skin. Flint nuzzled her shoulder, his warm breath puffing against her neck. She looked at the canyon. The walls leaned inward, narrowing the sky to a jagged blue strip. The sun beat down with a weight that felt personal, targeted, as though the heat itself had opinions about her presence. It was a place designed to break things. But something moved inside her then, not hope, nothing so generous, but a small, hard ember of refusal. A stubbornness born not of courage, but of spite. They had sent her here to fail, to disappear. Her brothers, the town, the territory, perhaps even her father. She was supposed to ride back to Buckhorn within a week, defeated, begging for a train ticket east. That was the story they were already writing for her, the inevitable conclusion that would confirm what they all believed, that a woman alone was a temporary condition, a problem that solved itself through surrender. She would not give them the ending they wanted. She would stay one night. She would sleep on the ground she owned. In the morning, she would decide. But she would not run. Not today. That first evening, she made camp just inside the canyon's mouth, where the walls offered a shallow overhang of shade. The rocks radiated the day's heat, long after the sun dropped below the rim, keeping the air warm and dry, and strangely intimate. She built a small fire from dead mesquite, the wood popping, sending up sparks that climbed the canyon wall like tiny orange climbers before winking out. The silence was deeper than any she had known, not the silence of a quiet room, which is merely the absence of noise, but the silence of deep time, of geological patience as of stone that had sat in this exact configuration for 10,000 years and would sit for 10,000 more. It was the silence of a place that had never needed human approval, had never asked to be useful, had never cared whether it was loved or hated, valuable or worthless. Lying in her bedroll, Maren stared up at the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. The stars were compressed into a narrow river of light, more brilliant for being framed. She thought of Mrs. Adler's words. He never drove a nail without a reason. Her father, who calculated the weight of every beam, who measured twice before cutting once, who never wasted a scrap of iron in his forge, had bought this canyon, had owned it for 20 years, had paid taxes on it, presumably, for 2 decades, had written it into his will with deliberate, legal precision. For what? As a joke? As an insult? Or as something else entirely? The question settled over her like a second blanket, lighter than the first, carrying no warmth but no cold either. It was a question, nothing more. But in a place where she had nothing, a question was a kind of possession. She slept. The sun woke her. It entered the canyon from the east, filling the narrow space with a light so intense it felt liquid, pouring down the rock walls in rivers of gold. Stone changed color as the light moved, shifting from deep shadow to amber to a pale, washed-out orange that made the walls look almost translucent. She sat up in her bedroll, blinking, and watched the transformation. It lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Then the sun climbed higher, the angle changed, and the magic flattened into ordinary daylight, harsh and bright and pitiless. She stayed. 3 days passed. She did little more than exist. She moved with the sun, following the narrow bands of shade as they migrated along the canyon floor, conserving water, conserving energy, conserving the small reserves of food that would not last forever. She walked the length of the canyon, a winding mile from the mouth to its abrupt end at a sheer rock face, a dead end in the most literal sense. She cataloged the terrain, the chaotic jumble of boulders, the dense thickets of mesquite and catclaw acacia, with thorns that could punch through boot leather, the loose, treacherous scree that slid underfoot like ball bearings. The place was exactly what it appeared to be, worthless. Yet she stayed. There was nowhere else to go. To ride back to Buckhorn would be to confirm every smirk, every whispered prediction, every public certainty that Maren Callister was finished. To ride east or west into unknown territory was a fool's errand for a woman alone with dwindling supplies. Here, at least, she was a landowner. The irony was bitter, but it was hers. She spent the hours observing. She learned which lizards preferred which rocks. She learned where the wind eddied and swirled inside the canyon, creating small dust devils that danced for a few seconds before collapsing. She learned the light, how it entered the canyon differently each hour, painting the walls in a shifting palette, how dawn was amber, midday was white, late afternoon was crimson, twilight was violet. The canyon had a severe, stark beauty, the beauty of a skeleton, all structure, no softness. She did not love it, but she began to see it. On the fourth afternoon, everything changed. She was sitting on a flat-top boulder near the center of the canyon floor, mending a tear in her sleeve with her mother's sewing needle, when she saw it. High up on the western wall, at least 200 feet above where she sat, something glinted. A quick, sharp flash of light, clean as sunlight off a signal mirror, bright enough to make her squint. It lasted a single second, then vanished. She lowered the needle, scanned the rock face. Nothing. The rough, weathered sandstone stared back, cracked and pitted and ordinary. She returned to her mending, her mind already dismissing the flash. Mica, probably. A shard of quartz embedded in the rock, catching the afternoon sun at a lucky angle. Geology playing tricks. Meaningless. But the next afternoon at the same hour, she found herself watching the western wall. She had chosen a spot with a clear line of sight, had set aside her work, had positioned herself deliberately, as though keeping an appointment. The sun lowered, its light thickening from white to gold. The shadows on the western wall shifted, the cracks and ridges of the sandstone rearranging themselves in the changing light. And then, at what seemed the exact same moment as the day before, it happened again. A brilliant, focused flash. Same spot, same duration, same clean, sharp quality. This time she was ready. She fixed her eyes on the location, memorizing the pattern of cracks around it, the dark horizontal ledge below, the triangular shadow above. The flash was not scattered, not diffuse, not the way mica or quartz caught light. It was focused, concentrated, as though something with a flat, smooth surface were reflecting the sun with geometric precision. It looked manufactured. She lowered her gaze. Her hands were still in her lap, the needle forgotten between her fingers. Her heartbeat had changed, quickened, not with fear but with something she had not felt since arriving in this place. Curiosity. A genuine, urgent need to understand. Because everything else in this canyon was brutal, obvious, honestly worthless. The rocks did not pretend to be anything other than rocks. The thorns did not hide their intention. The heat did not apologize. Everything here was exactly what it appeared to be, except that flash. That flash was a secret. Something placed, something positioned, something that did not belong in the natural vocabulary of the canyon. It was a detail that broke the pattern, a wrong note in a familiar chord, the kind of anomaly that once noticed could not be unnoticed. That night her sleep was different. The canyon still pressed close, still vast, still lonely. But now it held a question, and a question, in a place that offered nothing, was a form of oxygen. She began the next morning with a purpose she had not possessed since arriving. The glint was 200 feet up. On a section of the western wall, no direct route could reach. The cliff face was sheer, the sandstone too soft and crumbly to hold weight. The only possible approach was from the side, up a long slope of loose rock and scree that angled toward a narrow ledge system higher on the wall. But between her and that slope stood a dense wall of mesquite and catclaw acacia, a thorny barricade 10 feet deep, rooted in the rocky soil with the tenacity of things that survive where nothing else can. She would have to cut through. Using the small hand axe from her supplies and her camp knife, she began to hack at the brush. The thorns were vicious, curved hooks designed by evolution to grip flesh, to punish any creature foolish enough to challenge their territory. Within minutes, her hands were latticed with red scratches, thin lines of blood beading on her knuckles, her wrists, the soft skin of her inner forearms. The sun hammered down. Sweat ran into the cuts, stinging with a bright, focused pain that was almost clarifying. Her shoulders burned, her back ached. The axe, made for splitting kindling, was too light for this work, each stroke demanding twice the effort it should. She did not stop. The labor was something she had not expected to need, but it was exactly what she needed. Each swing of the axe, each wrench of a stubborn root from the rocky soil, focused her mind with a precision grief and anger could not match. She was not thinking about Dalton's smirk, about the lawyer's pity, about the empty room back at the ranch. She was thinking about the angle of the blade, the resistance of the wood, the placement of her feet on the uneven ground. The work consumed her, and in consuming her, it quieted her. The hours passed. The pile of cleared brush grew. A narrow winding path began to emerge through the thicket, raw and ragged, hacked from the living wood by force and persistence. Her dress tore in a dozen places. Her hands were raw, the blisters broken, the skin beneath pink and tender. She drank water, ate a strip of cold bacon, returned to work. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the rim, her axe struck something buried in the soil, not a rock. The sound was different, a metallic clink, sharp and bright, utterly foreign in this landscape of stone and thorn. She knelt, set the axe aside, dug around the object with her fingers. The soil was packed hard, resistant, yielding grudgingly to her efforts. She pried it loose, pulled it free. It was the head of a pickaxe, heavy, rusted, the steel pitted and scarred by years of exposure. The shape was functional, unremarkable. A tool. She almost set it aside. Then she turned it over, brushing the dirt from the flat surface beneath the eye, and her breath stopped. A mark. Small, precise, stamped into the metal with a single deliberate blow. A letter inside a circle. The letter was E. She knew that mark. She had seen it 1,000 times. On the hammers hanging in her father's forge. On the chisels he used for shaping stone. On the branding iron for the cattle. The hinges of the barn door. The hook beside the kitchen fireplace where he hung his hat. Every tool Maren Callister made he marked. A small, stylized E inside a circle. His signature, his claim of craft. The memory was immediate, physical. She was 10, standing in the doorway of the forge, the air thick with coal smoke, the heat a solid wall. Her father stood at the anvil, a piece of glowing steel clamped in the tongs, his right arm rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a piston. The clang of the hammer was deafening, rhythmic, almost musical. Each blow sent a spray of orange sparks cascading to the stone floor. He was making a pickaxe. This pickaxe, she recognized the shape of the eye, the curve of the blade, the proportions that were his habit, his instinct, the geometry of a man who had spent 30 years learning what a tool needed to be. He had been here. She sat back on her heels, the rusted pickaxe head cradled in her scratched hands, the weight of it suddenly enormous. Not the physical weight of old iron, but the weight of implication, of revelation, of a truth that restructured everything she thought she knew. Her father, who had supposedly never set foot in this canyon, who had bought it as a joke, as a folly, as a bad bet everyone laughed about, had stood on this exact ground, had swung this exact tool, had cleared this exact brush. The tool was not casually lost. It was buried, embedded in the soil at the base of a dense thicket, in the middle of a path that had once been cleared and then overgrown. Someone had worked here. Someone had labored here, in this precise spot, cutting through the same thorns she was cutting through now, following the same route she was following, heading toward the same point on the western wall. She looked up. 200 feet above, invisible now in the flat light of late afternoon, the glass waited. A small manufactured thing, set into stone by human hands. By hands she knew, by hands that had left their mark on every tool, every hinge, every piece of shaped metal in her childhood. The canyon was not a joke. It was not an insult. It was not a careless mistake or a fit of fancy. It was a project, a deliberate, calculated, secret project her father had pursued for years, perhaps decades. Without telling a single living soul, Maren Callister sat in the dirt of the canyon floor, her torn dress stained with sweat, her hands wrapped around a piece of rusted iron bearing her father's mark, and felt the ground beneath her shift. Not physically, deeper than that. The bedrock of her understanding, the story she had been told about this place, about her father, about her own worth, was cracking. Beneath it, something else was emerging. Something she could not yet see but could feel. The way you feel the vibration of an approaching train before you hear it. That light on the western wall was not a geological accident. It was placed there, positioned, calibrated. A signal meant to be seen from the canyon floor at a specific hour, by someone standing in a specific spot, looking in a specific direction. It was an invitation written in the only language her father had ever spoken fluently, the language of crafted objects, of things made with hands, of iron bent to purpose. That light was put there by the same hands that forged this pickaxe, the same hands that left a book on her pillow every winter without a word, the same hands that checked a horse's hoof with surgical gentleness, that reset a fence post with silent precision, that signed a will leaving her what the world called worthless. He never drove a nail without a reason. The question that had sustained her through 3 days of desolation was no longer abstract. It was concrete, specific, answerable. Not why did he leave her this canyon, but what did he build inside it? The answer waited 200 feet above, behind a pane of glass that caught the sun once a day like a lighthouse beam, a beacon set by a dead man, for the only person he trusted to follow. She was going to find it. The work that followed consumed her in a way grief never could. Grief was circular, a wheel turning through the same ruts, wearing them deeper with each revolution. Labor was linear. Each swing of the axe moved her forward by one branch, one root, one stubborn inch. There was no philosophy in it, no room for memory or regret. There was only the blade, the wood, the resistance, the yield. She rose each morning before the sun cleared the rim, ate a cold breakfast of cornmeal mixed with water, checked on Flint, filled her canteen from the dwindling supply she had carried from Buckhorn, then walked to the edge of the thicket where she had stopped the day before. The cleared path behind her was a testament to what the human body could accomplish when driven by something harder than hope. It was not hope that moved her. It was the pickaxe head, the letter E inside a circle, the knowledge that her father's hands had been here before hers. If you have ever taken a tool to a piece of ground that did not want to be tamed, If you have ever worked until the blisters broke and the raw skin beneath them burned with every grip, if you have ever felt that deep, honest ache in the shoulders and lower back that comes only from labor that matters, then you understand what drove Maren Callister through those first days. If that kind of work means something to you, let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to walk the rest of this path with her. The mesquite was the worst. Its roots ran deep into the rocky soil, anchored with a tenacity that bordered on spite. Each bush was a fortress of interlocking branches, armed with thorns, curved like fishhooks, designed not merely to scratch but to grip, to hold, to punish withdrawal more than advance. She learned to cut low, severing the main stem at ground level, then prying the root crown loose with the camp knife used as a lever. Her hands, already raw from the first day's work, developed a second layer of damage, deeper blisters beneath the broken ones, calluses forming over wounds that had not yet healed. The pain became background noise, constant, familiar, almost companionable. The catclaw acacia was different. Its thorns were shorter, sharper, set along the branches in pairs like the teeth of a saw. They caught her sleeves, her skirt, the loose strands of hair that escaped her braid. Each time she pulled free, the fabric tore, leaving another gap, another frayed edge. By the end of the first week, her morning dress looked as though something with claws had attacked it. The black wool, already faded by sun, was now shredded below the elbows, patched with strips torn from the hem. She did not care. The dress belonged to a life that had ended. The woman wearing it was becoming someone new, someone defined not by what she had lost, but by what she could cut, lift, carry, clear. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Her arms, which had been the arms of a woman who managed a household, strong enough for bread dough and laundry, but untested by heavier demands, grew harder, the muscles defining themselves beneath the sunburned skin. Her grip strengthened until the axe handle no longer slipped in her sweating palms. Her breathing, which had come in gasps during the first hours of work, settled into a deep, steady rhythm, her lungs expanding to meet the demands she placed on them. She ate everything she had, every strip of bacon, every handful of flour mixed with water into rough cakes baked on flat stones beside the fire. The food ran out at the end of the 9th day. She spent the 10th setting simple snares from strips of leather cut from her saddlebag straps, catching 2 pack rats from a colony nested in a rock crevice by evening. The meat was lean and stringy, roasted over mesquite coals until the fat sizzled and dripped. It was the best meal she had eaten since leaving Buckhorn. On the 11th day, she found the second marker. Another tool, buried deeper than the first, wedged between 2 boulders at the base of the scree slope. A cold chisel, its edge dulled by use, the steel darkened with age. The E inside the circle was stamped on the shank, smaller than the mark on the pickaxe head but identical in style. She held both tools side by side comparing. Same hand, same forge, same man. She was following him, not a map or a set of written directions, but the physical trace of his labor, the path he had cut through the same brush, the tools he had used, the marks he had left behind like breadcrumbs for someone who knew how to read them. He had planned for this. He had planned for her. By the end of the second week, the path was clear. It ran from the canyon floor to the base of the scree slope, a winding, narrow channel through the thorns, raw-edged, smelling of cut wood and disturbed earth. She stood at the end of it, looking up. The slope rose at a steep angle, 40 feet of loose gravel and broken rock and unstable footing, ending at the first solid ledge on the western wall. Above that ledge, the cliff face rose sheer for another 150 feet, cut by narrow horizontal ledges that zigzagged upward like a rough staircase, designed by someone who hated the idea of stairs. The climb began at dawn. She left her boots at the base of the slope, the leather soles too smooth for the loose rock. In her stock-hinged feet, her toes could grip the stone. Feel the difference between stable ground and the treacherous patches of gravel that would slide like water under pressure. The scree shifted with every step. For every 2 feet she gained, she slid back 1. Her hands grabbed at rock outcroppings, her fingers finding holds by instinct, by touch, by the desperate geometry of a body fighting gravity. The skin on her palms tore. Her fingernails broke. Sweat ran into her eyes, blurring the rock face into a smear of red and brown. She fell twice. The first time, a handhold crumbled, sending her sliding 10 feet down the slope on her stomach, the loose rock scraping through the thin fabric of her dress, leaving a long abrasion across her ribs. She lay still a moment, breathing dust, feeling the sting of broken skin, then pushed herself up and started again. The second fall was shorter, a patch of gravel giving way beneath her right foot, dropping her to one knee. She caught herself on a jutting stone, the impact jarring through her wrist, sending a bolt of pain up her forearm. She gripped harder, steadied herself, climbed on. When she finally pulled herself onto the first solid ledge, her arms were shaking, her chest heaving. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel of light. She collapsed against the rock wall, gasping, her hands hanging at her sides. Below her, the canyon floor stretched out in miniature, a ribbon of shadow and boulder, the cleared path visible as a pale scar in the dark green of the thicket. Flint stood near her camp, his head raised, watching her with calm, equine attention. She rested. She drank from the canteen slung across her body. She flexed her fingers, testing the damage. Nothing broken. Nothing that would not heal. The ledge was wider than it had appeared from below, perhaps 3 feet across, enough to walk with care if she kept her body pressed against the wall. It ran along the cliff face, angling slightly upward, curving around a buttress of stone that blocked her view of what lay beyond. She followed it, one hand trailing along the sandstone, her bare feet testing each step before committing her weight. The drop to her left was vertical, 200 feet of open air, ending at the boulder-strewn floor. She did not look down. The ledge narrowed, widened, narrowed again. In places it was barely the width of her foot, the stone crumbling at the outer edge, sending small cascades of pebbles into the void. In other places, it broadened into small terraces where she could stand with both feet flat and press her back against the solid wall behind her. The sun tracked her progress, the shadows on the cliff shifting as the light moved. After 100 yards, the ledge widened significantly, opening onto a broad terrace, perhaps 15 feet deep, sheltered by an overhang of rock above. The stone floor was smooth, swept clean by wind, warmed by the afternoon sun. It felt deliberate, shaped, as though someone had taken the natural contour of the cliff and improved it, chipping away rough edges, leveling the floor. There, directly in front of her, set into the face of the cliff at eye level, was the source of the flash, a small square pane of glass, no larger than the palm of her hand. Set flush with the surrounding stone, its edges sealed with a fine mortar, the color of the sandstone itself. It was invisible from below, except at the one moment each day when the lowering sun struck it at the precise angle to throw a reflection to the canyon floor. It was not glass carelessly inserted. It was glass that had been engineered, placed with the skill of a man who understood optics, angles, light, the kind of man who could calculate the trajectory of a reflection across 200 feet of open air and predict exactly where it would land. She ran her fingers over the cool, smooth surface. The glass was thick, slightly warped in the way of handmade panes, but clear, protected by its deep-set position in the stone. Surrounding it, the rock was not natural. What had appeared from below to be a rough cliff face was, at close range, dressed stone, blocks of sandstone cut and fitted together with joints so tight, she could barely slide a fingernail between them. The work was extraordinary, precise, patient, the kind of masonry that took not days but months, perhaps years. This was not a cliff face. It was a wall. She followed the wall to the left, her hand reading the stone-like text, feeling the dress blocks give way to natural rock, then back to dress blocks again. The wall was perhaps 20 feet wide, set into a natural recess in the cliff, disguised so perfectly that from any distance greater than arm's length, it was indistinguishable from the surrounding sandstone. She found the door 6 feet to the left of the window, a slab of sandstone 3 inches thick, cut to fit an opening roughly 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. It rested on hinges that were not iron but stone. Ingenious, cylindrical pins carved from the same sandstone, seated in sockets cut into the lintel above and the threshold below. There was no handle, no latch, no lock. only a small depression near the right edge, a finger-sized hollow worn smooth by use. She placed her fingers in the hollow. The stone was cool against her skin. She pulled. Nothing happened. The door was heavy, its weight resisting her effort. The stone-on-stone contact creating friction that held it in place. She adjusted her grip, braced her feet against the threshold, pulled harder. A low, grating moan, the sound of stone moving against stone after years of stillness, vibrated through her hands and into her arms. The door shifted, a quarter inch, then half. Then, with a sudden release of friction, it swung inward, moving on its stone hinges with a slow, smooth arc that spoke of expert craftsmanship. The air that flowed out was cool, not the dry, baked air of the canyon, but the cool, still air of deep earth, of enclosed space, of stone that had never known direct sunlight. It carried a scent, clean and faintly mineral, the smell of damp rock and deep time, of water moving slowly through stone. She stepped across the threshold. For a moment, total darkness. Her eyes, adjusted to the glare outside, could see nothing. Then, slowly, shapes emerged from the blackness, defined by the single shaft of light entering through the small window. Faint at first, then clearer, sharper, resolving into edges and surfaces, and objects that had no business existing 200 feet up a cliff face in a desert canyon 60 miles from the nearest town. She was standing in a room carved from living rock. The ceiling was the natural curve of a shallow cave, smoothed and shaped but not fundamentally altered, following the geology of the cliff rather than imposing a human geometry upon it. The floor was flat, hand-leveled, the tool marks still faintly visible in the stone, the parallel grooves of a chisel wielded with systematic patience. The walls combined natural rock and the same dressed masonry she had seen outside, fitted blocks sealing gaps, squaring corners, turning a natural hollow into a habitable space. Against the far wall stood a workbench, sturdy, built from timber that must have been carried up the cliff in pieces and assembled in place, the joints pegged rather than nailed. The wood was pale, aged, dry but solid, free of rot in the desert air. Above the bench, tools hung in neat rows on wooden pegs driven into the stone. Hammers, chisels, a small crosscut saw, a hand drill with interchangeable bits, a draw knife, a spokeshave. Each one clean, oiled, ready for use. Each one bearing on its handle or its steel the small familiar mark. To the right of the bench, built into an alcove carved deeper into the rock, was a cot. A simple wooden frame strung with rope and a grid, supporting a mattress of canvas stuffed with dry grass. A folded blanket lay at its foot, moth-eaten at the edges but whole. In the corner nearest the door, a stone basin sat on a natural shelf, positioned beneath a dark, wet patch on the ceiling, where water seeped from somewhere deep inside the cliff. The seep was slow, a single drop forming at the apex of the wet stain, swelling, hanging, falling into the basin with a soft, musical note that repeated at intervals of perhaps 10 seconds. The basin was half full of water so clear it was nearly invisible, its surface disturbed only by the concentric rings radiating from each falling drop. A spring, a hidden, living spring, fed by some subterranean source that defied the desert's claim of absolute dryness. The sound of the water was the sound of the room, its heartbeat, its proof of life. On a small table beside the cot, carved from a single piece of wood with the same patient skill that characterized everything here, sat a tin box. Rectangular, perhaps 8 inches long, the lid fitted tightly, sealed against dust and moisture. The tin was old, its surface dulled by time but uncorroded. The dry air of the sealed room had preserved it perfectly. Maren's hands shook as she lifted the lid. The hinge resisted, stiff with age, then gave. Inside, resting on a piece of faded blue velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal. The binding was cracked, the leather dry, the pages yellowed at the edges. But the book was intact, protected by the tin, by the sealed room, by the mountain of stones surrounding it. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was her father's. She would have known it among 1,000 scripts. The strong vertical letters, the slightly oversized capitals, the firm pressure that left grooves in the paper. It was the handwriting of a man who gripped a pen the way he gripped a hammer, with his whole hand, holding nothing back. My dearest Maren, if you are reading this, Then you were strong enough to look past the world's judgment and find your way here. I could not give you the ranch. Your brothers understand land in terms of money, of cattle, of power. They would have crushed you, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple inability to see you as anything other than a problem to be managed. I have watched you for 22 years. I have seen your patience, your steadiness, your quiet refusal to break. You are the strongest of my children, and the only one I trust with a secret. I have left you something better than a ranch. Not a piece of land, but an anchor. A place the world cannot touch. A place to be quiet and strong. This house is yours. The water is clean. The tools are sharp. Build your life here. Know that you were seen. Know that you were loved. She could not stand. The strength went out of her legs as though someone had cut the strings. She sank to the stone floor, her back sliding down the wall, the journal open in her lap, the shaft of light falling across the page, illuminating the words, the handwriting, the grooves left by her father's hand, pressing hard, pressing the truth into the fiber. She wept. Not the hot, silent tears she had shed at the canyon's mouth, born of grief and exhaustion. These came from deeper, from a place beneath language, beneath thought, a place where the body stores what the mind cannot hold. They were tears of relief so profound, it was almost violent. A dam breaking, a pressure releasing. The sudden, overwhelming knowledge that she had not been wrong. He had seen her. Through all the silence, through all the years of unreturned devotion, through the final public cruelty of the will, he had seen her. He had known her in a way no one else ever had. Not her brothers, not the town, not even herself. The canyon was not an insult. It was a sanctuary. The deed was not a dismissal. It was a map, leading her to the one place on earth her father had built for her alone. Callister's Folly was not a joke. It was his masterpiece. She sat there until the tears stopped on their own, the light through the window, shifting from gold to amber to deep red. Shadows filling the room, the drip of the spring, counting the seconds of her grief, the way it had counted the years of her father's labor. The journal held more. She read it that evening by the light of a candle she found beneath the workbench, its flame small but steady in the still air. Maren Callister had written in the same direct, sparse style he had spoken. Short declarative sentences, stripped of ornament, each carrying exactly the weight it needed and nothing more. The entries were dated, spanning 15 years. The earliest was from 1866, the year after he had purchased the land. Cut the first stone today. Everyone thinks I ride south for silver. Good. Let them think it. The most recent was from 1881, the year his health began to fail. Finished the door hinges. Stone on stone, no iron, nothing to rust. She will need this place to last. Between those two dates, the journal recorded the slow, secret construction of the house and the cliff. Each spring, Ephraim told his family he was heading south to prospect for silver, a plausible story in a territory where half the male population harbored dreams of striking a lode. Instead, he rode to the canyon, alone. He spent 2 to 3 months each year cutting stone, fitting blocks, carving the basin, leveling the floor, carrying timber up the cliff on his back, piece by piece, assembling the bench, the cot, the table, in the sealed darkness of the cave. 15 years of solitary labor, performed in secret, recorded in a journal no one was meant to find, unless they had already proven themselves capable of the journey. He had thought of everything. The window, positioned to catch the afternoon sun and throw its signal to the floor below. The door, disguised by dressed stone that matched the natural cliff. The spring, fed by the geology of the mesa above, independent of rainfall or drought or season. The tools, oiled and ready after years of waiting. He had even left food stores in the cellar, dried beans, sealed tins of corn, hard biscuits in airtight containers, enough to sustain one person for weeks. The depth of the planning staggered her. This was not the work of idle afternoons. This was the calculated, long-term project of a man who had looked at his family, at the dynamics of greed and entitlement and loyalty and weakness, and had seen the future with terrifying clarity. He had known what Dalton would become. He had known what Silas would fail to be. He had known that his daughter, the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one who showed up without being asked and left without being thanked, would be the one pushed out, the one who would need a place to stand. Some men build a legacy from money. He had built hers from stone. The weeks that followed were a kind of resurrection. Maren swept the stone floors with a bundle of dried grass, aired the blanket over the terrace railing, polished the tools until the steel gleamed. She discovered the house was larger than it first appeared. A second room, smaller and narrower, opened through a passage at the back, carved deeper into the cliff, naturally cool, the temperature constant regardless of the heat outside, a perfect cellar. Beyond the dry goods her father had stored there, she found a small barrel of lamp oil, extra candles, a coil of good rope. He had planned for years of habitation, not mere survival but life. The water was cold, clean, faintly mineralized, the best she had ever tasted. It flowed into the basin at a rate that, over a day, produced more than enough for drinking, cooking, washing. The overflow ran through a channel her father had carved in the floor, exiting through a small hole in the outer wall, tracing a narrow path down the rock face to the canyon below. It was this trickle, this thin line of water running over red stone, that would eventually undo the very peace it created. But she did not know that yet. She followed the notes in her father's journal, which described the soil on the sunny terraces below the house, the plants that would grow in the shelter of the canyon walls, the way the spring's runoff could be directed to irrigate a small garden. She cleared a patch of ground on a wide ledge south of the house, broke the thin, rocky soil with a handpick, mixed in the decomposed plant matter she gathered from the canyon floor. She planted seeds from packets she found in the cellar, seeds her father had saved labeled, in his precise hand, squash, corn, beans, the three sisters of desert agriculture, chosen by a man who knew which plants could survive on little water and poor soil. The loneliness that had defined her first days transformed. It did not disappear. It shifted. It became solitude, which is loneliness stripped of its cruelty. The same condition viewed through a different lens. She was alone, but she was not abandoned. She was alone in a place built for her, provisioned for her, designed to sustain her. The silence of the canyon was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a room waiting to be lived in. She read the journal every evening, a few pages at a time, savoring the entries the way she savored the last cup of coffee before the supply ran out. Her father emerged from the pages as a man she had never fully known, a man of deep private thought, of fierce love expressed not in words but in iron and stone, of an understanding of human nature that bordered on prophecy. The entries were not sentimental. They were practical, detailed, occasionally wry. Today the limestone split along the grain. Should have seen coming. Wasted a day's work. And then, pages later, almost an aside. She mended the broken harness today without being asked. Nobody thanked her. Nobody ever does. That is how I know she is the one. But peace in a desert canyon, like water in a stone basin, can overflow its edges. The change came from the north, carried not by wind or weather, but by the loose, unreliable network of human gossip that connected even the most remote corners of the territory. A prospector named Griff Healy, a leather-faced man who made his living sifting creek beds and slot canyons in search of color, passed through the southern reaches of Callister's Folly on his way to a rumored strike near the Dragoon Mountains. He was not looking for water. He was looking for a shortcut. But when he stopped to refill his canteen at a seep, he knew from previous trips he noticed something new. A thin, steady line of clear water running down the western cliff, tracing a dark streak on the red stone before vanishing into the gravel. In the desert, water that runs is news. Water that runs steadily, regardless of season, in a canyon everyone knew was dry, was a headline. Healy mentioned it in Buckhorn 3 weeks later, at a card table in the back of the Silver Strike Saloon. He mentioned it the way prospectors mention everything, as a curiosity, a footnote, something to fill the space between bets. Within 2 days, every rancher, speculator, and drifter within 50 miles had heard the story. Water in Callister's Folly. Steady water. Year-round water. Dalton Callister heard it on the third day. He was in the same saloon, at a different table, losing money he did not have. The gambling had begun the year before Ephraim died, small stakes at first, then larger, then ruinous. Dalton owed $1,300 to a consortium of ranchers and merchants in Buckhorn, a debt secured by nothing but his name and the ranch he had inherited. The ranch was profitable, but the profits were being consumed faster than the cattle could produce them. He was a man walking a narrowing ledge, and every week the ledge grew thinner. The news struck him like a fist. He set down his cards, pushed back from the table, walked out without a word. The men he left behind wore the particular mix of curiosity and satisfaction that attends the sight of a desperate man receiving new information. Dalton's mind worked in straight lines. Water in the desert was valuable. The Southern Pacific was surveying a route through the Southern Territory, a route that would need water stops, refueling depots, provisions for construction crews. Land with water along that route was worth 10, 20, 50 times what dry land was worth. Callister's Folly, that worthless canyon everyone laughed about, sat less than 15 miles from the proposed corridor. If there was water there, real and reliable, the canyon was not worthless. It was a fortune. The canyon belonged to his sister. The arithmetic of greed is simple. What you need is separated from you by a person. The person becomes an obstacle. The obstacle must be removed. Dalton did not think in terms of cruelty. He thought in terms of necessity. The debt was real. The deadline was real. The consequences of default, the loss of the ranch, the public ruin were real. Against that reality, his sister's feelings, her rights, her claim to a patch of ground nobody had wanted, were abstractions, variables to be solved. He rode to Prescott. Harlan Jessup kept an office on the second floor of a brick building on Cortez Street. Above a dentist's practice, a proximity that customers of both establishments found darkly appropriate. Jessup was not a lawyer. He was something more dangerous, a man who understood the law well enough to bend it, who knew which territorial clerks were amenable to persuasion, which regulations could be reinterpreted, which deadlines could be manufactured from nothing. For 20 years he had made his living acquiring properties through a combination of legal pressure, bureaucratic sleight of hand, and the simple exhaustion of opponents who could not afford to fight. Dalton laid out the situation. The canyon, the water, the deed, the sister. Jessup listened with the patient, evaluating stillness of a man calculating odds. When Dalton finished, he opened a drawer, removed a sheet of paper, uncapped his pen. There is a provision. The territorial land statutes require that older parcels carry a surveyor's certification on file. If your sister's deed lacks it, the claim can be challenged, the land held in question, the matter dragged through the territorial office for as long as necessary. His voice was flat, professional, the voice of a man describing a mechanical process. Most deeds filed 20 years ago never had such a thing. And even where a certification exists, there are other avenues. Filing errors, boundary disputes, tax irregularities. The pen resumed its movement. The question is not whether the claim can be challenged, Mr. Callister. The question is whether your sister has the means to defend it. Dalton thought of his sister as he had last seen her clearly, in the lawyer's office, in her mother's mended dress, her hands folded in her lap, 22 years old with no money, no allies, no husband, no knowledge of the law. She doesn't, he said. Then the outcome is not in doubt, only the timing. The deal was struck in under an hour. Jessup would prepare the challenge, file it, handle every point of contact with the territorial office. In exchange, he would receive 40% of any proceeds from the sale or lease of the property. Dalton would keep 60% and the deed. Neither man spoke Maren's name aloud again. The sky to the north began to change on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Maren noticed it from the terrace, where she was tending the garden that had begun to push green shoots through the rocky soil. The horizon, usually a hard, clean line between brown earth and blue sky, was blurred, smudged by a mass of cloud so dark it looked like ink spilling across paper. The air pressure dropped. She felt it in her ears, a subtle tightening, the way the atmosphere announces that something large is coming. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had swallowed the northern sky. Not the high white clouds of fair weather, but low, heavy, purple-black formations that moved with visible speed, their bellies swollen with moisture drawn up from the gulf. Lightning flickered inside them, horizontal flashes that lit the cloud mass from within, turning it into a bruised, pulsing lamp. The wind arrived first, roaring down the canyon with a force that sent gravel, skittering across the terrace and tore leaves from her squash plants. She brought Flint up the path, fighting the gusts, and led him to the three-sided shelter her father had built against the cliff beside the house, stone walls, and a timber and stone roof, open only on the leeward side. Flint pressed himself against the back wall, his nostrils flaring at the charged electric smell of the coming storm. The rain arrived with the violence of artillery, not drops but sheets. Solid curtains of water driven horizontal by the wind, slamming against the cliff with a sound like continuous thunder. Lightning cracked across the sky every few seconds, each bolt followed at once by an explosion of sound that shook the stone beneath her feet. She stood in the doorway, protected by the overhang, and watched the dry canyon floor transform. Within minutes, the first trickle appeared, brown water snaking between the boulders. Within 10 minutes, the trickle became a stream. Within 20, the stream became a river, a roaring, churning flood carrying everything in its path. Boulders, uprooted mesquite, whole dead trees, a force that would have swept away anything caught on the canyon floor. From her perch, 200 feet above, the flood was a spectacle, terrifying in its power, indifferent in its beauty. It surged through the narrow canyon like liquid earth, filling the space wall to wall, erasing in minutes the path she had spent 2 weeks clearing. She felt the loss of that path as a sharp, absurd pang, then let it go. The house stood, the terrace stood. The spring dripped its steady rhythm, undisturbed by the chaos below. Her father had built above the floodline. He had known. Then, through a brief lull in the downpour, she saw them. 3 riders at the canyon's mouth, fighting to control their horses at the edge of the churning water. Even through the rain, even at that distance, she knew the silhouettes. The broad, rigid posture of Dalton, the narrower, hunched form of Silas, a third man, a ranch hand, his hat gone, his horse rearing at the thunder. Dalton was looking up. He had seen the house. His face, caught for an instant in the gray light between lightning flashes, ran through a sequence of emotions so rapid they blurred: disbelief, recognition, fury, calculation. But his eyes were not on the house. They were fixed on the western wall below it, where the spring's overflow traced its thin, steady line of clear water down the rock. Even in the chaos of the flood, that line stood out, clear against brown, constant against turbulent, the signature of a source that had nothing to do with rain. His voice reached her through the storm, distorted by wind, broken by thunder, but unmistakable. "Margaret, we heard a rumor. There is water here." He had called her by their mother's name, not her own. A slip, or a habit, or a cruelty. She did not answer it. "This is family land." The wind shredded his voice into fragments. "That water belongs to the ranch." Maren stood in the doorway of her father's house, 200 feet above her brother, the storm raging between them like a living wall. She did not shout. She did not need to. Her voice carried downward with the clarity of a stone dropped into still water. "This land was father's. Now it is mine. You have no claim here." Dalton's horse stamped, fighting the mud. Silas sat motionless behind his brother, his face white even in the gray stormlight. He did not speak. He did not look up. His hands gripped his saddle horn with the frozen intensity of a man trying to hold himself together. The flood made approach impossible. The canyon floor was a river, impassable, lethal. Dalton stood at its edge, boots sinking in mud, hat streaming, fists clenched, screaming into a storm that swallowed every word. He was powerless, separated from what he wanted by the same forces that had shaped the canyon itself: water and stone, and gravity and time. The things their father had understood. The things Dalton never would. They retreated. Dalton wheeled his horse, drove in his heels, rode north into the rain without a backward glance. Silas followed a beat behind, his head turning once to look up at the cliff. His expression, glimpsed through the downpour, was not anger. It was closer to recognition, the look of a man seeing something he had always known, but never let himself admit. Maren watched them vanish into the curtain of rain. then leaned against the stone doorframe, her arms crossed, her heart hammering. The storm raged another hour, then passed, leaving the world washed raw. The canyon floor steamed, the flood receded, revealing the altered landscape beneath. New boulders deposited, old paths erased, the cleared thicket buried under a foot of silt. The air smelled of wet stone and ozone and beginnings. But the image that stayed with her was not the storm. It was Dalton's face in the moment before he turned his horse. Not defeat, not surrender. Something colder and more patient than rage. The face of a man who has identified a problem and already begun to calculate its solution. He would be back, not with a flood between them, not with words shouted across water. He would come back with paper, with leverage. He would come prepared. He came 2 weeks later, in the bright, dry calm of a desert morning, though it was not Dalton who rode into the canyon. It was a stranger, mounted on a tall bay, dressed in a dark suit absurdly out of place in the red dust. He rode with the straight-backed, unhurried posture of a man who believed the landscape owed him passage. Harlan Jessup dismounted at the base of the cliff, tied his horse to a mesquite stump, removed his hat, looked up at the terrace where Maren stood. "Miss Callister, my name is Harlan Jessup. I represent your brother Dalton in a matter concerning this property." He reached into his coat, produced an envelope, held it up. "This is formal notice that your claim to this parcel has been challenged. The territorial statutes require a surveyor's certification on file for a deed of this age. Our inquiry finds no such certification. You have 7 days to vacate, after which the territorial marshal will be asked to enforce the order." Maren descended the path, not because she feared him, but because she wanted to read the document with her own eyes, to see the words, to understand the shape of the attack. Jessup waited, hat in hand, his face arranged in an expression of professional regret. She took the envelope, opened it, read the single dense page. The core of it was simple. The deed lacked a required certification. Without it, the claim was void. 7 days. She looked up. Jessup met her gaze with the practiced steadiness of a man who had delivered such news many times. "This land belonged to my father for 20 years. Her voice was quiet, controlled, each word set down with the deliberation of a stone. He paid for it. He built on it. He died owning it." Jessup's smile did not change. "The law is the law, Miss Callister. 7 days." He remounted, tipped his hat with a courtesy that was its own kind of violence, and rode out of the canyon without hurry. The bay's hooves crunching on gravel, each step a small mechanical demolition. Maren stood at the base of her cliff, the paper in her hands, the sun on her face, feeling the ground shift beneath her for the second time. Not the shift of revelation, of a secret uncovered, the shift of threat, of a world closing in, of walls she could not see drawing tighter. 7 days to lose everything her father had spent 15 years building. Everything she had bled and climbed and cleared and earned with her own hands and her own stubbornness. That evening, as the light failed and the canyon filled with shadow, she sat in her father's chair at his table, Jessup's envelope on one side, the journal on the other. She had read the journal through twice, every entry, every date, every spare practical observation. But she had not read the final pages. They were written in a different ink, darker, the hand slightly less steady, the letters of a man whose strength was leaving him. She turned to them now. The entry was dated March 1881. His last visit to the canyon. "If they come for this land, and they will, because greed does not rest, and your brothers will learn what water means in a desert, you will need more than stubbornness. Look beneath the third board of the workbench. What you find there is the armor I forged for you. I could not swing this hammer forever, but I made sure that when I set it down, you would have everything you needed to swing your own." She crossed the room. The workbench was built of heavy planks, their surfaces scarred by years of use, their edges rounded by the pressure of hands and tools. She counted the boards from the left. 1, 2, 3. The third looked identical to the others, same width, same grain, same wear. She pressed on it. It gave slightly, a barely perceptible flex. She worked her fingers into the gap between it and the adjacent board and pried upward. The board lifted, revealing a shallow compartment beneath, lined with oilcloth. Inside lay 3 things: The first was a folded sheet of heavy paper, brittle with age. She unfolded it carefully. A survey map, hand-drawn but precise, showing the boundaries of the canyon parcel in meticulous detail. In the lower right corner, a signature. James R. Whitfield, Territorial Surveyor, September 14, 1866. Below it, a seal, the official stamp of the Territorial Survey Office, embossed into the paper with enough force to leave a permanent impression. It was the certification Jessup claimed did not exist. It had existed for 19 years, filed not in a public office, but in a hidden compartment in a house carved from stone. The second was a bundle of papers tied with cotton string. She untied it, spread the pages on the table. Tax receipts, 20 of them, one for each year from 1866 to 1885, each signed by the Buckhorn tax collector, each stamp paid in full, each documenting a payment made by Maren Callister for the property known as Callister's Folly. 20 years of unbroken, documented, receipted ownership. The third was a sealed envelope of heavy cream paper, the kind used for formal correspondence. On the front, in her father's hand, an address. The Honorable Territorial Land Commissioner, Prescott, Arizona Territory. The seal was unbroken, the letter never sent, a weapon held in reserve, a final round loaded but not fired, left for the person who would need it most. She held it to the candlelight and saw through the paper the shadow of dense handwritten lines. A letter, an argument, a defense prepared by a man who had spent 15 years anticipating the exact attack that had just been launched. Her father had not merely built her a house. He had built her a fortress, stone walls against the weather, paper walls against the wolves. He had foreseen Dalton's greed. He had foreseen the challenge to the deed. He had foreseen the need for a surveyor's certification, for tax records, for a letter to the one official in the territory, with the authority to settle the matter for good. He had foreseen all of it, because he knew his children the way a blacksmith knows iron, by how it bends, by how it breaks, by what it becomes under heat and pressure. A man does not spend 15 years building a house in a cliff for someone he does not love. Everything her father ever gave her had been forged in silence, and silence, she understood now, was the loudest language there was. She read Jessup's notice once more, slowly, weighing it against what her father's journal had taught her. Ephraim had recorded every territorial statute that touched land ownership because its accurate records were part of his nature, and nowhere in those pages was there any certification requirement of the kind Jessup described, imposed on the schedule, he claimed. The provision, as he had framed it, did not exist in the shape he gave it. The notice was a bluff, dressed in legal clothing, its authority manufactured, its purpose to frighten a woman alone in a canyon into surrendering what was hers before she thought to check. But a bluff filed in Prescott, unanswered, could become a judgment. If Jessup reached the territorial office first, if he laid his fabrication before a busy clerk, and no one contradicted it, the machinery of the law would begin to turn in his favor. And machinery, once turning, was hard to stop. She could not simply wait behind her stone door for a marshal to arrive. She had to carry her father's armor to Prescott herself and put it in the hands of the one man with the power to end this. 7 days. 4 to ride to Prescott if she pushed hard and nothing went wrong. That left almost nothing for the return, and less than nothing for the 1,000 things that could go wrong on a 4-day ride through open country. But there was no other path. She packed by candlelight, the survey map, the tax receipts, the sealed letter, all wrapped in oilcloth and stowed in her saddlebag with the care of a woman, handling something that could not be replaced. Water, food, her camp knife. She left the journal in the house, the one thing she could not risk losing on the trail, locked the stone door behind her, and descended the path in darkness. Flint waited at the base, ears pricked, sensing her urgency. She saddled him by feel, her hands finding the buckles by memory, tightening the cinch, checking the girth. The moon was a thin curved blade of white, just enough light to find the canyon's mouth. She mounted. The leather creaked. Flint stepped forward, his hooves finding solid ground with the quiet confidence of an animal who trusted his own feet more than the dark. 7 days. The clock was already running. She rode north through country that offered no mercy and asked no permission. The first day she covered 40 miles, more than she had believed possible, pushing Flint to a steady ground-eating trot across the flats, walking him up the grades to spare his legs, stopping only to let him drink at a muddy tank she remembered from the ride down. She ate in the saddle. She slept 4 hours in a dry wash. Flint hobbled beside her and was moving again before the sky had fully lightened. The land climbed as she went north, the low desert giving way to higher country, mesquite yielding to juniper and scrub oak, the air growing thinner and cooler with elevation. On the second day, a shoe worked loose on Flint's off hind, and she lost 2 hours in a settlement barely large enough to hold a blacksmith, standing at the man's shoulder while he set the new shoe, her jaw tight with the knowledge of every minute bleeding away. On the third day, a spring storm caught her on an exposed ridge, and she sheltered in the lee of a boulder while lightning walked the high country, unwilling to risk Flint's footing on wet rock in the dark. Every delay was a weight added to the same scale, and the scale was tipping. She rode into Prescott on the morning of the fourth day, gaunt and windburned and gray with trail dust, Flint's head low with exhaustion, her father's papers riding against her hip like a second heartbeat. The territorial capital rose around her, a real town, brick and frame buildings, a courthouse square, board sidewalks crowded with people who had somewhere to be, freight wagons and buggies and saddle horses filling the streets. After weeks of canyon silence, the noise struck her like a physical thing. She had no time to be overwhelmed by it. She asked directions twice and rode straight for the Territorial Land Office. It occupied the ground floor of a solid brick building off the courthouse square, its front room divided by a long wooden counter, clerks moving behind it among tall cabinets of files. Maren stepped to the counter, her boots loud on the plank floor, and set her oilcloth bundle down with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere on the trail. She stated her name, her parcel, her purpose. She had come to defend her title against a challenge she believed to be fraudulent, and she needed to place her documents before the land commissioner himself. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and the harried patience of someone who heard grievances all day, listened, then consulted a ledger, running his finger down a column of entries. His expression when he looked up was not unkind, but it was not hope either. There is already an action filed on this parcel, Callister's Folly, filed 4 days ago by a Mr. Harlan Jessup on behalf of Dalton Callister. He turned the ledger so she could see the entry, the date, the docket number. It is in the queue for review. These things take time, Miss Callister, sir. Weeks, sometimes months. The commissioner reviews contested claims in the order they are filed. 4 days ago, Jessup had ridden straight from her canyon to Prescott and filed before she had even finished reading her father's final entry. He had a 4-day head start and a place in a line she was standing at the back of. The 7-day deadline he had handed her was not a deadline at all. She saw now, but a distraction, a clock, designed to keep her sitting in her canyon, watching the days run out while the real work was done here, in this room, in her absence. The floor seemed to tilt under her. She had ridden 4 days on almost no sleep, worn Flint to the bone, spent the last of her strength and her supplies to reach this counter, and the machinery had already moved past her. For the first time since she had lifted the lid of that tin box and read her father's first words to her, she felt the cold certainty that she was going to lose. Not because her cause was weak, because she was one woman with a satchel of papers, standing at the end of a line, and the men arrayed against her had money and connections, and a 4-day start. She gripped the edge of the counter and made herself breathe. She thought of her father carrying timber up a cliff face on his back, one board at a time, for 15 years, with no one to see it, and no promise it would ever matter. He had not built that house in a single triumphant season. He had built it against exhaustion, against pointlessness, against the near certainty that his effort would go unwitnessed. If he could lay stone for 15 years without applause, she could stand at a counter and refuse to be moved. I understand there is a line, she said, and her voice did not shake. But the action filed against me is built on a false claim. Mr. Jessup asserts that no surveyor's certification exists for this parcel. I am holding that certification. It was signed and sealed in 1866. She unfolded the survey map and laid it on the counter, turning it so Whitfield's signature and the embossed territorial seal faced the clerk. A fraudulent filing is not a matter that waits in a queue for months. It is a matter that ought to be corrected before it does harm. I will wait as long as I must to place this before the commissioner, but I will not leave until I have. The clerk looked at the seal. He looked at her face, at the trail dust and the wind burn, and the flat, immovable steadiness in her eyes. Something in his manner shifted, the reflexive deferral of a man who processed paper, giving way to the attention of a man who had just seen paper that mattered. He asked her to wait. He carried the map through a door at the back of the room. She waited. She stood at the counter, unwilling to sit, aware of Flint tied at the rail outside with his head down, aware of the papers still in her hands, aware of every minute the way she had been aware of them for 4 days. People came and went around her. The light through the front windows shifted as the morning wore toward noon. When the clerk returned, he was not alone. The man behind him was older, silver at the temples, wearing a dark coat and the settled authority of someone whose signature ended things. This was Commissioner Alfred Doyle, and he held the survey map in his hand as though it had already changed the nature of his afternoon. Miss Callister. He studied her over the top of a pair of reading spectacles. My clerk tells me you've ridden from the southern desert to contest a filing, and that you're carrying an 1866 survey with a territorial seal on it. He set the map on the counter between them. Come back to my office. I would like to hear this from the beginning, and I would like to see whatever else you have in that bundle. His office was a quiet room lined with shelves of bound statutes and rolled plats. He sat her down. He listened, without interrupting, as she laid it out from the beginning. The will, the worthless canyon, the discovery of the house her father had spent 15 years building in secret, the spring, the notice Jessup had delivered, the compartment beneath the workbench. As she spoke, she laid each document before him in turn, the survey map, the 20 years of tax receipts, and finally the sealed letter addressed in her father's hand to the holder of Doyle's own office. Doyle turned that last envelope over in his hands, examining the unbroken seal, the address. This was never sent. He left it for me to carry. I think he knew that if it ever needed sending, I would be the one to send it. Doyle broke the seal. He unfolded the pages and read, and the room was silent but for the rustle of paper and the muffled sounds of the street beyond the window. Maren watched his face as he read, watched his brow draw down, watched him turn back to reread a passage, watched something that was not quite anger settle into the lines around his mouth. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at her for a long moment. Your father was a careful man. He was. He names the certification requirement precisely. He cites the actual statute, the actual filing dates, the actual provisions, and he anticipates, almost word for word, the argument that has been filed against you. Doyle tapped the pages. Mr. Jessup's action rests entirely on the claim that no certification exists, and that a filing requirement was imposed which this parcel failed to meet. Your survey disproves the first, and the second, the requirement he cites, does not exist in the form he describes. I administer these statutes, Miss Callister. I know what is in them. What Mr. Jessup has filed is not a good faith dispute over a technicality. It is a fabrication, submitted under oath, intended to strip a lawful owner of her land. The words settled over Maren like the first cool air after the storm had passed. She had believed it. She had checked it against her father's journal and believed it. But to hear it spoken by the one man in the territory whose belief was also a verdict was something else entirely. A weightlifting that she had carried so long, she had stopped feeling its full measure until it was gone. There will be a hearing, Doyle went on. It is required for a contested claim of this kind. But I will tell you plainly that with this survey, these receipts, and your father's letter in the record, the outcome is not in serious doubt. And filing a fraudulent instrument with this office is not a small thing. It is a territorial offense. Mr. Jessup and anyone who knowingly directed him will have a great deal more to answer for than a lost claim. The hearing was held 3 days later in a paneled room off the courthouse square, and Maren sat through it in a clean dress she had bought with nearly the last of her money, her hands folded in her lap the way they had been folded in Mr. Pritchard's office 2 months and a lifetime before. Harlan Jessup was there, no longer wearing the easy confidence he had carried into her canyon. He had come to Prescott expecting to argue against an absent woman, or an overwhelmed one, or one represented by a tired local lawyer working from incomplete records. He had not come expecting the original 1866 survey, the complete tax record, and a letter from the deceased owner citing chapter and verse of the very statutes Jessup had misrepresented. He tried. He was a practiced man, and he did not fold easily. He spoke of ambiguities, of clerical gaps, of the burden resting on the claimant. But every argument broke against the documents on the table before the commissioner, and against Doyle's own knowledge of the law he administered. When Jessup asserted the certification requirement that formed the spine of his case, Doyle asked him to cite the statute by number. Jessup cited a number. Doyle opened the bound volume on his desk to that number and read aloud what it actually said, which was not what Jessup had claimed, and the room understood, all at once and completely, that the case had never had a foundation at all. The ruling came without delay. Maren Callister's title to the parcel known as Callister's Folly was affirmed as sound, complete, and beyond challenge, her ownership documented across 20 unbroken years. The action filed by Harlan Jessup was dismissed, and Jessup himself was remanded to answer a charge of filing a fraudulent instrument with the Territorial Land Office, a charge that carried the weight of federal law and the near certainty of prison. Whatever he had hoped to earn from 40% of a stolen canyon, he would now spend years and every dollar he had defending himself against the consequences of having reached for it. Dalton was not in the room. He had not made the ride to Prescott, had trusted Jessup to handle the matter at arm's length, to keep his own name at a careful distance from the machinery. But distance offered no shelter. The ruling named him as the party on whose behalf the fraudulent action had been filed, and the news traveled back to Buckhorn faster than Maren could have carried it. By the time she began her own ride south, the story was already in every saloon and mercantile and church pew in the county. Dalton Callister had tried to steal his own sister's inheritance with a forged claim and had failed, and was now tangled in the wreckage of it. The consortium of men who held his $1,300 in debt read the same story and drew the obvious conclusion about the reliability of a man who would do such a thing, and they began, quietly and then not quietly, to call in what he owed. She met Silas in Prescott before she left, though she had not sought him out. He was waiting outside the land office on the morning of her departure, standing beside the rail where Flint was tied, his hat in his hands, having ridden up on his own once word of the hearing reached him. He looked older than she remembered, or perhaps only more tired, the echo of Dalton finally worn thin enough to show the man underneath. "I didn't come to make excuses," he said, and could not for a moment meet her eyes. "There aren't any. I knew what Dalton was doing. I knew it in the lawyer's office when Father's will was read, and I knew it in the storm when you stood in that doorway, and I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my fight. But silence is a choice too. Father knew that. I think that's why he left it all to you and nothing that mattered to me." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry, Maren. It's too small a word. But it's the true one." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought of all the times he had stood behind their brother saying nothing, and of how easy it would be to answer his years of silence with her own. But she had spent a season learning what her father had built out of patience, and she found she had no use for the satisfaction of a closed door. "Father didn't leave you nothing because he stopped loving you," she said at last. "He left you a chance to become someone he could have. That part is still yours. What you do with it is up to you." She swung up into the saddle. "You still have time, Silas. Don't spend it the way you spent this." She did not tell him he was forgiven, because he was not yet, not all the way. But she left the door open, which was more than he had done for her, and they both knew it. He nodded and stepped back from the rail and let her go. She rode south into a season that had turned while she was gone. The killing heat of high summer had broken, softening toward the golden light of autumn, and the desert that had nearly broken her on the ride down received her almost gently on the ride home. She was a different rider than the grieving woman in the black wool dress who had first traveled this road. She knew where the water tanks were. She knew how to read the country. She carried, in the affirmed title folded against her hip, the legal weight of a home no one could take from her, and she rode toward it, not as a place of exile, but as the only place on earth she wanted to be. Callister's Folly received her in the amber light of a late afternoon, the spring's thin line of water bright against the red stone, the garden on the terrace gone lush and green in her absence, squash vines sprawling over the rocks, corn standing tall, bean pods heavy on the stalk. She climbed the path to the house that was hers beyond any argument now, pushed open the stone door her father had hung on stone hinges so that nothing would ever rust, and stood in the cool quiet of the room he had spent 15 years carving out of the mountain for her alone. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like a life. She widened the garden, terracing a second plot below the first, training the spring's overflow through a channel of her own carving to reach the new ground. She repaired the flood damage on the canyon floor, hauling deadfall, rebuilding the lower path stone by stone. And in the evenings at the forge, her father had built into a sheltered alcove near the house, she began to learn the last of his crafts. She was clumsy at first, ruining more iron than she shaped, but her hands had grown strong, and her patience was bottomless, and slowly the work came to her. The first tool she finished clean, a small hand chisel, she marked as he had marked all of his, but with her own letter now, a stylized M inside a circle, the line of the Callister craft carried forward by the one child who had earned it. Buckhorn rewrote its story about her as small towns do. The whispers that had followed her out of that lawyer's office in the spring, poor Maren, foolish Maren, finished Maren, had curdled and reversed. Now she was the woman who had inherited a worthless joke of a canyon and turned it into a hidden oasis, who had ridden 4 days alone through the desert to face down a corrupt speculator in the territorial capital, and won. Travelers began to detour to the mouth of Callister's Folly, hoping for a glimpse of the woman who lived in the cliff, though none came up the path without an invitation, and few were invited. Lachlan Everett was one of the few. He was a mapmaker for the territory, a lean, quiet man in his late 20s, whom she had first met in passing in the land office during her days in Prescott, waiting to file his own survey work when she came through with her father's papers. He had heard the whole story of the hearing afterward, as everyone in the office had, and something in it had lodged in him. His work carried him through the Southern Territory that autumn, mapping the country for the same railroad whose distant approach had set the whole affair in motion, and he found reasons to route his travels through her canyon. He never came empty-handed. A bolt of good cloth from a Prescott merchant, a new bit for Flint's bridle, a sack of seed she could not have found closer than the capital. He helped her with the work that went easier with 2 pairs of hands, wrestling a fallen boulder from the garden plot, raising a length of fence. They worked well together, in the comfortable, unhurried silence of 2 people who did not need to fill the air with words. In the evenings, they sat on the terrace with coffee as the sun went down behind the western rim, and he told her about the country he had mapped, the vast empty stretches waiting for settlement, and she told him, a little at a time, about her father, piecing together for a listener the portrait of a man she was only now, after his death, coming to understand. He asked her once, on a cool evening, as they staked the last of the tomato plants against the coming wind, what it had been like to open that stone door for the first time and understand what her father had done. She was quiet for a while, looking at the house glowing softly in the lantern light, at the solid, unyielding stone that had sheltered her, at the clear water threading down from the spring. She thought of the deed that had once felt like a verdict against her whole life, and of everything it had turned out to mean. Everyone thought he'd left me nothing, she said at last. A pile of rock in the middle of nowhere. A joke with my name on it. And for a while I believed them. Because it's easy to believe you're worth what other people say you are. She set the last stake and pressed the soil firm around it. But he didn't leave me a piece of land. He left me a place to stand. Somewhere the world couldn't reach in and take. It took me 22 years and a dead man's letter to understand the difference. But I understand it now, and I'll never mistake one for the other again. Lachlan looked at her, and in his face there was no pity, none of the shallow sympathy she had ridden away from in the spring, only a deep and steady regard for the woman she had become, and something warmer underneath it that neither of them was in any hurry to name. There was time for that. There was time for all of it now. The last light left the canyon rim, and the first stars came out in the narrow river of sky above the walls. The same stars she had lain beneath on her first terrible night in this place, when she had been certain she had lost everything. She had not lost everything. She had lost a life that was never truly hers and found, in the rock everyone had laughed at, the one thing no one had thought to give her and no one could take away. Her father had spent 15 years and the last strength of his hands making sure of it. He had said almost nothing to her in life. He had said everything that mattered in stone and in water and in a letter sealed and waiting, and in a house built high above the reach of the flood, for the one child he had always, silently, completely seen. She banked the forge for the night, took up the lantern, and went inside, into the quiet, into the home that was hers. While the spring counted out the seconds in the dark, the way it had counted the years, patient and clean and endless, the heartbeat of a place built entirely out of love.